Hello, everybody, and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Shalene. My name is James Arico, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at St. Thomas Aquinas College and a proud 2006 graduate. I'm very excited to be here today with Dr. Robert Shalene. Welcome, Dr. Shalene.
Welcome. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
As many of you know, Dr. Shalene is a Professor Emeritus of St. Thomas Aquinas College, serving the university for over 40 years. Doc is currently a resident and has been a resident of Tappan, New York for over 70 years. As some of you may remember, back when we were students in the early mid-2000s, Dr. Shalene would teach a class called The Presidency every 4 years during a presidential election and host a town hall in Longheath Library to correspond with that class. When I came back as Assistant Director for Alumni Relations, one of the first things I thought about doing was connecting with Dr. Shalene to bring you all a town hall on the 2020 presidential election with Dr. Shalene. So that is what we're here to do today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shalene again and to kick off our conversation. To begin, I need to start with a basis for our conversation, Dr. Shalene. So can you just give a little bit of background on how the political system in the United States has evolved over the course of the years?
Sure, I'd be glad to. We have somewhat of a unique system. If you go back to when our country was founded, you hear people talking about the founding fathers all the time. Almost universally, they were opposed to the idea of parties. They didn't like parties. Washington thought they'd be the end of the country. Madison called them factions and didn't like the idea. And I bring this up because one of the reasons that our system has lasted as long as it has is because of the two-party system. The two-party system evolved, and we always had two parties. Since 1850, we've had the same two parties, which are the Republicans and Democrats, which is sort of an amazing thing to have. And the system, the reason when we talk about our political system, the ironic thing is, not ironic, but the different thing is that we had nothing to base it on. We were able to do whatever we thought was right. And when they wrote the Constitution, they wrote it sort of from scratch, and they figured out what they wanted to do. They wanted to, and originally it was the people who in those days meant land-owning white males would elect the House of Representatives. The state legislatures would elect the senators, and the nebulous thing called the Electoral College would elect the president. Now, you hear complaints about the Electoral College all the time now. Originally, it was set up basically so the people didn't vote for the president, and it's still that way. And it was the electors didn't even have to be chosen by the people. In those days, most of them were chosen by state legislators or special commissions that were set up. So the Electoral College has been the one backbone sort of our system. And it works because I'm sure most of us know that the number of electoral votes that you have, it depends on your population plus 2 for a senator. The minimum number being 3. The maximum number right now is California, which has 53. And the total electoral total is 538. So you need 270 to win. You'll hear a lot of talk on election night about 270. That's the key number, and it's always been a key number since we've had this number of electors. The only time that our two-party system really fell apart, and this might be seen as ominous for today, was when was in the decade before the Civil War. And before the Civil War, political parties basically collapsed. Some of them were still technically in existence, but by the 1856 election, you had 4 candidates running. The 1860 election with Lincoln, you had 4 major candidates running from various different parties. And Lincoln, as we know, was elected with only 38 or 39% of the vote. But since you can say that since the Civil War, our system the system itself has basically been the same. When the parties chose the candidates at conventions, the first convention being in 1832, which I'm sure if you wanted to trick anybody, the party that first held the first presidential nominating committee was the Anti-Masonic Party. Not a very well-known party, to say the least. But we still do that, and we just finished them now. We had virtual ones this time, and that was a place for the National Party to meet and select the president. What's happened to change that is that the presidential candidate is no longer selected at the convention. It hasn't been selected since 1952. Adlai Stevenson was the last one. And this happened because of a little thing called primary. And what happened was the parties now have primaries, and basically the candidates are chosen before the nominating convention. Nominating convention is a time for the party to get together. A lot of wealthy people come in and make a city wealthy, and that's basically what it does. So our system has been sort of remarkably constant. There are problems with this, of course. Parties have too much power. And everything in our system is based on parties. If you go to an election office in a town or a county, there'll be one Republican and one Democratic election official. So it's very, very, very strong now. I don't see it necessarily changing, particularly because it seems that part of it, selecting the candidate, although some people might disagree right now, selecting the candidate has worked out reasonably well as far for the period of time. And I think we have to realize that we've had basically the same system for 200 plus years and a modified system for 130. So it has to be, we have to be doing something right, you might say. There's always that, and so that's how the system has evolved, sort of. So.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Really interesting information. It's still very enjoyable for me to learn from you. Just so everybody knows, we are recording this on October 1st, just 2 days from the first presidential debate. So Dr. Shaleen, why don't you give us your thoughts on the first presidential debate and who you potentially saw as the winners and losers from that debate?
Well, to quote somebody I heard on the radio, television the other day, the loser in the debate was probably the country, because people expected something, and it was more intense. I thought it was a real shame. I thought the moderator didn't do the job that he could have done. I don't know why they don't have kill switches so they can shut people up after 2 minutes. I just thought it was really a shambles. I don't know if anybody actually won or lost, because I think basically what it did was try to solidify the bases. People I've talked to since then who were Trump people, or are still Trump people who didn't like Trump before it, now dislike him more if that's possible, but it's not going to change. It's not really going to change their vote. I should put out that in 1980, when Carter ran against Reagan, the knock on Reagan was he was too old. This seems silly now, but he was too old. And so what happened was the Republicans used the debates as a chance to show that Reagan wasn't too old. And he had some good clips. There you go, again, some famous clips. But so actually, that's one time which the debates actually helped a candidate, because a lot of people at that point just wanted to see that Reagan wasn't too old to do the job, and he did it. And of course, the most famous debate was Kennedy, was the first one, which was Kennedy-Nixon.
Right. And do me a favor, remind our listeners how old Reagan was back during that debate you're speaking about.
He would have been 72. He was 72 when he finished his term. So he was like 66 or 68.
Okay, and our current candidates, I believe, are 77 and 78 respectively for Trump and Biden.
I know that that's Biden. I think Trump might be about 75, but I should have looked this up. But if I had my Google here, I could check it. But
no, it's okay. But I just wanted to give the viewers a contrast of what those ages look like.
Without a doubt. Then you had Warren was Warren was in her 70s. So like Bloomberg was in his 70s. So the age idea really hasn't had any, is sort of out the window now. Because part of this is because you have more senior citizens.
Right.
voting, and they say, well, I'm good, I'm in good shape, so I can vote for that person. It's,
Right. Right.
but I thought the debate in some ways was pretty terrible. I think that you had the president of the United States and his opponent acting like children. When Trump made those faces into the camera, all I could think of was hearing my grandmother say, "You got to stop that." And I was like 5 years old. I remember my grandmother telling me, "You're gonna, your face is gonna stick that way." I thought he interrupts all the time. I personally feel that that's why he's president today, because he hijacked the Republican nominating debates and just talked over everybody. Trump just never stops.
Right.
I really thought that Chris Wallace would be stronger in stopping them, because you just have to stop them. That's why I think they need a kill button. That after 2 minutes you can shut the person off, because I think it was pretty clear that Biden planned to counterattack. He was ready to come back. He was ready to come back at him. I mean, he did come back at him. He just comes back. He seems different than when Trump attacks. And Trump, I think one problem for Trump is he comes off as a bully in this.
Yes.
And, you can't keep calling somebody stupid or crazy Joe or any of this stuff. It doesn't come across. Plus, I think in one problem that Trump has had, I don't think he's ever realized that he's the president of the United States and he's speaking for the United States when he speaks. Because I even had some Trump people tell me that they were really shocked at the way he acted in this.
Yeah. I mean, something I found truly interesting, and I watched the debate with an open mind, as I would do every 4 years. I felt like Vice President Biden spoke to the American people. He looked directly into the camera and he spoke to everybody watching. I felt like President Trump spoke to Chris Wallace and to Joe Biden. So I thought that was an interesting contrast in style, but I also think it is indicative of their two campaigns running. Biden is speaking on behalf of, or is trying to speak on behalf of the American people, and Trump is trying to speak on behalf of President Trump.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think that his actions, he interrupted all the time. He would never let Biden finish what he was saying, and I just thought it was a terrible performance. But I have to think, if I'm Trump, this got me the presidency. I'm going to keep going with it. Plus, he's hard to change. I'm sure he was advised by his people not to do some of the things that he did. But I think Trump is unique as a president because there doesn't seem to be anybody who can tell him what to do. Where all the previous presidents had, I mean, Obama had Holder and Axelrod, and you go back, Bush had Hughes and Cheney. They had somebody that could say, you're wrong, don't do that. Trump doesn't seem to have anybody to do that, and it comes out on the debates. I thought I was surprised that I talked to a number of people who said that they thought that Biden didn't answer the questions. Now, that didn't come across to me, but a number of people I talked to, not Trump people either, I mean, sort of undecided people, but it was 90 minutes.
See, I can understand that. I actually personally, and I know we're not supposed to speak about our personal feelings, but personally, that's how I felt. I felt like, truthfully, neither of them answered most of the questions. And again, going back to your point, I think you're right that Trump his whole game plan is to interrupt and to distract and to puff out his chest. And again, partly just sitting there watching it myself, I think he was doing that on purpose, specifically to give credence to their claims that Joe Biden has some mental deficiencies. Because if you notice, whenever Joe Biden got interrupted or was forced to lose track of his thoughts, was when his stutter would become prominent. And they're in the days or after the debate, they're using that to say that he's got mental defects. And as somebody that is not a specialist in any of that, it was very easy to see what was happening. And to me, it's sad where we are as a country right now, because it's really not about politics anymore. It's not about what's best for the country. You've got half the country who are so excited that Trump is involved and Trump is president because he's making quote unquote America great again. And then you've got the other half of the country who don't understand how that's possible that the other people like him. So at this point, we're not electing a president. We're electing TV show personalities. Either way, either with Biden or Trump, because that's how it was portrayed in debate to me.
And one thing that came across in the debate was Trump does this all the time. This is his modus operandi, you could say. So he's good at it in
Right.
being what he does. Biden had to do something that it wasn't his natural style. His natural style isn't to attack and to call the person "shut up, man" and all this kind of stuff. So
Right.
he didn't seem as forceful as he could have,
Right.
because that wasn't his style. You could always tell when it's not a style.
Right.
But I just think that Trump doesn't see any reason for changing his ways. I think that they're going to try. The Democrats are already talking about not having any more, canceling the second two debates.
Yeah.
I don't really think that's possible. But
Well, they've come out and said yesterday that that Joe Biden will do the next two, but the Commission on Presidential Debates has said they're going to come up with stricter policies. But again, who knows if they will follow them. The one other thing I wanted to point out, as I said, that I don't believe that anybody answered any of the questions, but I did think there was one poignant moment in the debate, and that was when President Trump brought up Joe Biden's sons, Hunter and Beau, and Joe was able to turn to the camera and talk about Hunter's addiction and how he's recovering and how he supports his son and his family. The undecided voters that I have spoken to in the last couple of days in preparation for this conversation, many of them have said that was the moment that they felt like they might have their candidate, was because President Biden is dealing and has dealt with many traumas that the everyday American is struggling with on a daily basis, whether it's personally or with their family. I mean, we're in one of the biggest opioid crises of our time. And for him to be able to stand up there and say, I understand what you're going through, that resonated with a lot of the undecided voters that I spoke with. So I just wanted to make sure that we had a chance to discuss that.
oh yeah, and I also, if you go back to Bill Clinton, remember his famous line, "I feel your pain."
Yes.
Same kind of thing that Biden's playing on. Now Trump, it just, to me, he comes off as a bully, and I guess he basically is a bully in a technical sense. And he doesn't understand why people are opposed to him. Now, I think that it's insane. One of my biggest problems with Trump, and there are many, but one of my biggest problems is he seems psychologically incapable of admitting that he was ever wrong, no matter what it is. Even there's proof. I had more people than Obama did at the inauguration. That's not true. It's a provable lie, and he said that. And the other day, and during the debate, he actually said, "I have the support of the mayor of Portland. I mean, the police commissioner of Portland," and he didn't.
Right.
The commissioner came out and said, "No, I didn't." One more point before we get off this. I don't think Trump realized the uproar that would come from him saying about stand down but be ready to the Patriot boys. First place, I tend to agree with him. I don't think he knew who they were.
I agree. I don't think so either.
He didn't realize that kind of white supremacist group. But I mean, tossing a home run pitch to the other team, he just said this, and he had a chance to rebut it, and he said, "Well, I didn't really know who they were." So I thought that was a needless gift to the Democrats, you might say. But in closing, Chris Wallace has always been a very tough interviewer, and I thought he would be tougher on the candidates. I mean, he was at times, but there are tricks you could pull that to try to calm things down. I think they obviously lost control of the debate in certain times.
Right,
So I
I
have to see.
agree.
I assume it's CNN next time, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I actually didn't look into it.
Anderson Cooper or Wolf Blitzer or one of those people, I would think.
Yeah, and I think at this point we should give some credence to the other side. We spoke a lot about how well Joe Biden did in some aspects, and we've kind of hammered away on President Trump. But I feel like at this point we need to be equally as complimentary to President Trump. So I will something that during the debate that he spoke about that really resonates with me as somebody who has health problems himself is he keeps talking about lowering drug costs and making healthcare more affordable for the American people, and that's something that I have bought into with President Trump from in 2015. And I'm going to use a quote from him when he came down the escalator. That was one of the platforms that he said he was going to run on, and that's something that he's been doing and chipping away at slowly. And whether or not you think the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was good or bad, some of the things that he has done for prescription drug costs in this country currently, I do want to give credit where credit is due. My prescription drug costs have gone down significantly since he signed a couple of his executive orders around healthcare. I want to give you an opportunity if there's anything you'd like to point out that you feel that President Trump has done well or has stuck to his guns on.
Oh, I think he's stuck. And you talked about the drugs and the healthcare. I blame most of that on his problems with the Republicans because they ran for 4 years against Obamacare. Then they had nothing to replace it with. It was inconceivable that they had to do it. So, and McCain stuck him on the one bill when they were going to appeal it. I think he's done certainly. I think he's actually been pretty good on foreign policy, except for that he makes enemies of our former friends.
Right.
But he has. We are getting. He put tariffs on China. He's put sanctions on some places. People you might say, are more willing to believe that the United States is going to do something. So plus he's, it seems to have helped the economy. I think he has a debate, but I think you also one problem that he has. I don't think he has too big a problem with this, but you tend to believe your own press clippings. And then when he goes to these rallies and he has 10, 15, 20,000 people telling him, you're the best, you're the best, you're the best. It only brings about what he thinks is already the fact. I do think that I don't think he understands that one of my big problems is I don't think he understands that COVID at all or anything. I just don't think he understands that. To me, the president, regardless of who it is, should be wearing a mask all the time, just as an example to the people. Right. He doesn't wear it. Whether he believes in it or not, it'll help the people. So,
well, and that's where I think that sometimes he doesn't consider himself the president for the American people. He considers himself the president for his base. I won't even say for the Republican Party. He's the president for his base, and he's saying what he knows his base wants to hear because that's how he won the presidential election in 2016. If you look at that map on election night, the usual suspects fell in play. New York, California were Democrat. Texas and Florida fell Republican. But then you had the entire upper Midwest and the Bible Belt all fell red. And it was because he was speaking to he spent money in those states and he spoke to his base in that states. And it really, truly, to me, it was a groundswell win. He won because he played, unfortunately, lack of a better way to put it, he played the game right. He went and spent money in states where he knew what his plan was when he was president would win over the populations in those states. And he spoke right to the farmers and he spoke right to the auto workers who had been out of work under President Obama. And I think that's what he's doing now. Again, to me, in 2020, it's harder to do that because of all the other extenuating circumstances. You've got the Black Lives movement, you've got the defund police movement, and then on the other side you have the Blue Lives Matter movement. And I think it's been harder for President Trump to start that groundswell again closer to this election.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that if you go back and look at the polls in 16, if you look at the polls day before election, 2 days before election, it was much closer because the pundits just stopped looking at the polls with like 4 or 5 days, a week to go, and they changed rapidly. And I also think that what you say is true, but I also think that Hillary Clinton ran a terrible campaign.
Well, yes.
I really think she just, and there's a couple of books out about it. It's her advisors, this guy Mook, who was her primary campaign manager, they ran a very poor campaign. Not to say that Trump didn't run a good campaign, but they ran a poor campaign.
Well, no, they ran a
anybody.
campaign. They ran a campaign of "there's no way we're going to lose to this guy," quote unquote.
Yeah, and she didn't listen to her husband. She didn't
Right.
listen to Moore, Michael Moore from Michigan, who went and banged on her headquarters in Washington and said, "You have to go to Michigan," and she didn't do it. She was more concerned about big numbers in states that she was going to win.
Right.
So that I think that was a good part of it. But Trump's problem now is he's got his base solidified, but I don't think the debate did anything to bring those independent voters over to mine.
Right.
I also think that him winning was not that big shouldn't have been that big a surprise. Myself, I thought that Hillary would win, but I was never surprised. This business that he only had a itty tiny window and things, that just wasn't true.
Right.
So I think that the election was much closer. Brexit was in England was another case. The people were sure that there was going to be one way. So, but I don't know. I just think that you're going to be 2 more debates and you'll have a VP debate too. I think you'll see some changes in the debates.
No, I think so too.
Because the country can't take another one of those. I don't think.
No. Okay. At this point in our conversation, I feel we would be remiss if we didn't give a few minutes to discuss the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the effects that and the Trump nominee to the Supreme Court is going to have, not only on the election, but on the next, as President Trump said, 40 to 50 years of the Supreme Court. But before we jump into that, could you do me a favor and just explain to our listeners a little bit about succession in the Supreme Court? There's a lot going on now about what's constitutional, what's not constitutional. So a 30-second history lesson on what the succession plan for the Supreme Court looks like.
Well, I think there's a lot of talk about that, but I think it's pretty straightforward. The president makes the appointment. They're talking about changing that now. Democrats are talking about changing that if it happens. Right now, the president appoints, the Senate elects. So, approves it. And it's 50 votes. A big thing was when they cut it from 60 to 50 votes. There was, and now that was Harry Reid did that for the regular judges. And then and Mitch McConnell did it. I just like to point out, if we're going to talk to the Supreme Court, nowhere in the Constitution is it mentioned that they can declare a law unconstitutional. That's just evolved over time, and it was basically because arguably the greatest, I don't even think it's arguable, but the greatest Supreme Court justice was John Marshall, was from Virginia, and he basically declared that they could do it. And since then, the Supreme Court has been able to rule on the constitutionality. What happens now is, I think both sides are massively hypocritical when it comes to succession to the court, because when Obama, when I guess it was, what's the one from?
It was in February of 2016.
Yeah,
he nominated Merrick Garland.
Oh, yeah, but who died?
Antonin Scalia.
Scalia died, and Obama was going to appoint. The Republicans said you can't do that in an election year, and
Right.
all of them pontificated at length. And because the Republicans had the Senate, they were able to keep them. This is one reason why a lot of Democrats are so incredibly bitter, because they thought that they really had one. So this time now, Ginsburg dies, and the Republicans want to appoint somebody, the Democrats say you shouldn't do it in an election year. So they're both arguing exactly the opposite. If you can even look at speeches for people that were in the Senate for 4 years ago, they're arguing exactly the opposite way. So that's it. But it's pretty straightforward when they appoint a justice. And ideally, the Democrats are talking about doing different things, stacking the court. Everybody's quite upset that Biden didn't say he wouldn't oppose that. And stacking the court, putting an age limit on the court. Now, of course, this has been tried. The original court wasn't 9 people anyway. The original court was 5, and it's gone as high as 12 during the Civil War. So 9 isn't a sacred number, which some people are saying. But the Supreme Court goes only so far too. The Supreme Court knows that it can't go too far. Like it didn't outlaw segregation until it had most of the country behind it.
Right.
It okayed segregation in '96 with Plessy versus Ferguson, I think. But now you have a case where and you can't tell who's going to die or who's going to retire either. So this just so happens that Trump has 3. This will be the 3rd one.
Right.
The first 2 he was able to get through, 2 very conservative and also very young by court standards. I think Gorsuch was like 40, 48, and Kavanaugh is roughly the same.
Yes.
So by normal Supreme Court standards, they're going to serve at least 30 years.
Right.
So that'll bring them up to the late 70s, early 80s. And so that blows the minds of the Democrats. And then now you have another one who's arguably to the right of both of those 2. And so he'll have a 3rd one. She's in her 40s also, 47, right. 40. And so it's become the Democrats, they say they'll do anything they can, but if you catch the Democrats being honest, they really admit they can't stop. The only way it stops is if Republicans vote against it.
Right. They have no power to stop the vote in the Senate.
No, the only one that definitely said she won't is Collins. And I think that's the only way she wins re-election.
I agree.
Murkowski in Alaska said she thought this, but she might vote for it. It doesn't look very good, I don't think. I think they'll probably get her through. And of course, there's the underlying cases are the left is mortally afraid that they're going to repeal Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Because that's a tremendously important thing to the left. And the right people wanted to have it repealed. And same thing with healthcare, and there's a lot of different ones, but it's interesting. And as far as packing the court, that's been tried. Franklin Roosevelt in 1937 tried to pack the court. Because the Supreme Court had ruled a number of his New Deal pieces unconstitutional. Right. So then his idea to show you what he thought. He also thought he couldn't lose by then. You could retire at 70 with full pay. And then if you didn't, he could appoint someone to be a co-judge, so up to 15. So the court would have been, if this had passed, there was 5 judges, I think, that were over 70. The court would have gone to 14 or 15 members. And of course, Roosevelt would have appointed them all. So that's the difference. As far as Ginsburg, she definitely was a reliable liberal vote on the court. I think that many people, if you actually catch them, they love her and everything else, but they all feel she should have retired when Obama was president. I think this is, but Trump can't even leave that alone because he said, I don't think she really ever said that, about waiting to have the next president. He couldn't just let it go the way it was. He had to say, I don't believe she ever said that. I think they made that up.
Right.
And, I think. But
and as monumental as Trump potentially nominating and having voted in Amy Coney Barrett to the court, where do you see the political landscape as we come into the midterms in 2022 and the next presidential election, which will be in 2024?
Of course, it all depends on who wins the presidency. We're talking about what happens in the future. I think the Republicans in the Senate, I think they could very well lose the Senate. They only have 3-vote majority, and they could lose it, and partially because of this because of Barrett's appointment. And so I mean that would be a big blow, because if you have the Senate and the president, you can do whatever you want with the court.
Right.
You know, it's just, you know, by the way, and I should point out that going back to the famous election of 2000 with Gore and Bush, there's a story which apparently is true because I've heard from different sources. Sandra Day O'Connor was watching the returns come in with someone else, with a few friends. And when I look at one point, they declared Gore the winner. And she said, oh damn, I'm going to have to serve another 4 years. So they're all pretty politically, they talk about no politics, but it's all politics. But
Oh, of course it's all politics. And I think it's the one thing that's nice, and circling back to the Supreme Court, I know we were talking about midterms, but I think something that's interesting to look at is the few decisions that have come out of the court with Gorsuch and Trump's other nominee. They have both leaned towards the other side in those two, Roberts, in those two rulings. So I think they're showing that what everybody says when they're nominated and appointed to the Supreme Court is that they will uphold the laws of the Constitution. They're looking at it and they're doing that to the best of their abilities, looking at the laws generally as constitutional lawyers. Roberts and Gorsuch both are hang their hats on being constitutionalists, and so them leaning a little bit more left in the last couple of rulings truly shows, I hope, that they're willing to look at everything as a whole as opposed to who nominated and got them onto the court.
Yeah, I think if you I listen to all the stations anyway.
I do too.
I like it. But if you listen to Fox or Banner or the others, it drives them crazy what you just said, that they tend to move to the left. Almost never do they move to the right. Almost never do the left-leaning judges move to the right. A possible exception would be one of those, but the big exception was the one who was a football player, Whizzer White. Whizzer White was appointed by Kennedy. Everybody thought he was going to be, but he moved a little bit to the right.
And who did you say that was again?
The Republican. Whizzer White, Baron Whizzer White was his name.
Okay,
that's a trivia question. What Supreme Court justice led the NFL in rushing? So that's a trivia question. But the point is that what you say is true, and if they are true to their feelings and their beliefs, and they believe in the courts, they're going to rule a certain way.
Right.
Now, usually you can tell how they're going to rule. Now, Scalia brought in the new thing about originalists, which says you have to take what they said, which some people say is kind of, you can't take the exact rulings and or meanings of the court, of the Constitution, and rule it. But I think you're right. Ideally, you bring in people who are very smart, even Barrett. Everybody thinks that she's like super intelligent.
Right.
It's ironic that almost all of them go to Harvard or Yale. If you look at the Supreme Court, they're either undergraduate or law school. I don't think Barrett went to Harvard.
Right.
And so intelligent. Trump's people would like to get people necessarily who didn't go to Harvard, except that he's very influenced by the Federalist Society, which is a conservative group, and they're the ones that pushed Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. So, and plus the hearing on Kavanaugh was brutal, and the one I heard, this one here is going to be brutal if they do it for Comey.
No, I agree. I think that this next confirmation hearing is going to be one for the ages. And depending how you look at it, it's one for the ages in the win column, or it's one for the ages in the loss column. And that's really where I think we are politically in this, as we sit on at 10:39 on October 1st in 2020. Somebody's going to say it was a win. Somebody's going to say it's a loss. And you know,
Yeah,
you know who's losing? The American people are losing, because they're looking like, our country looks like a toddler right now in the world stage, and no one's really concerned about that.
I'm usually a pretty positive guy and think about positive. This is the first time in my life that I'm not sure that the country is going to come out of all this better than they went into it. I have some doubts. I just want to say one more thing about the Supreme Court, about
Sure.
Barrett. If you go and look at her, she was a federal appeals court judge.
Correct.
Feinstein basically said it's the dogma of the church about abortion. Now they're coming in, if they bring that up when she's Supreme Court, that's very sticky, and it's going to turn people the wrong way. I mean, I know that's what you could think that, but Feinstein came right out and said, because you're Catholic, you can't rule the way you should rule and things. So
right.
That's something to watch.
Okay, and in your vein of positivity and ending this this discussion on a positive note, this is the one and only time I'm going to ask you for your opinion. I want to hear about what your greatest election night memory is, as a scholar, of someone who studied elections, and as you've said to me in our conversations leading up to this, as a child who was very interested in the elections. Tell me what your favorite election night memory was.
Well, as an election nut who never sleeps on election night and stays up all night, and I should say, my change now, nothing can top 2000, because that was, it wasn't, I always felt I was cheated up to that time, because the election was always decided on election day. And I would think how great it would be to have it not. And it happened. It would be hard to beat that as far as for my greatest memory. I have other memories. I have memories on some local races. I stayed up till, I stayed up all night. And no, I don't know why we did this, but it was a close race, so we watched the returns. I had when I was very young, I watched the Republican convention, and Eisenhower was nominated. And my mother was at work, and she called, and I said, "I don't know what this means, Mom, but Eisenhower was nominated," and she was very excited. I would say, and in my Kennedy was pretty good. When he won, it was kind of exciting to me. But I got a little less excited as I got older. I guess you get a little more bitter. But 2000 was just one of those things, and it kept going. I watched all the shows because they tape and repeat, so I could watch like Kennedy and Rachel and all of them that night. I don't think I got 2 hours of sleep for a month. But that would be my number one. It would be hard to really beat that. So as far as that goes.
Okay,
but,
and can you do me a favor? Can you mention the name of that local election you were talking about, just so our listeners can hear the connection cut out?
Oh, the one I was was happy with. I was involved in Scott Vanderhoff's first run, and nobody thought he had a chance in the beginning, and that was kind of a special night for me. I had to pay the penalty of being put on the county ethics board, which turned out to be a bit of a grind. But no, that was the one local one, and then there was some even closer, like supervisor of the town and things like that. But I said I like them. If we're talking about the elections and my own views, the map guy on MSNBC is the best. For the election, he points out different states are doing what in counties. When they have the map on election night, he's by far the best. So, all right. But
well, thank you so much, Dr. Shaleen. This was an adventure. I thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with you. Leading up to this, having to have these conversations with you again has been really a true pleasure of mine. So thank you on behalf of the Office of Institutional Advancement and St. Thomas Aquinas College for taking the time to sit and chat with us today. And maybe we could do this again after the election and have a different conversation.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I can talk about this stuff forever. So it's very, it's nice to have somebody else that's interested in it. Like you.
All right. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You also to you.